Good morning. Good morning. All right. Wasn't last night fantastic? Hat tip to Sally Mesner and all of the people that worked with her to make that event happen. That was just so good, so good. We suffered a breakdown in communications, however, because the beer and wine did not show up for the after hours in the Bell and Beacon. And we're going to talk about that with the folks that we need to talk about that so that next year it won't happen again. One other announcement before we get started, and that is that by the break time this morning, after morning prayer but before the workshops, there will be sign-up sheets for those of you who are going to be attending the banquet for us to organize tables. So look out for those where Doreen and Susan have been sitting out in the hallway. If you're attending the banquet, find your table on paper and help us arrange the tables for that. There's Sally. Thank you, Sally. We're thanking you again for last night. Sally. And here's Leaf to introduce our speaker this morning.
Thank you, Jim. I am delighted to welcome to the Institute for Liturgical Studies, Kelly Sherman-Conroy. Kelly Sherman-Conroy is a keeper of stories. She is a Lakota Lutheran theologian of the Ogallala Sioux tribe. She comes to us as the first woman Native theologian with a PhD in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. Whoop, whoop, whoop. Yeah. She is a writer of liturgies, a writer of many things. She is a teacher, professor of an Indigenous spirituality course currently being offered at Augsburg, and so many folks wanted to join that St. Olaf needed to pick it up and expand registration who could come. She cares about the intersections of community and liturgy and is called to the nurture of community through story. And she's also has recently written a liturgy for the World Council of Churches. We are so grateful to have Kelly with us for this very important topic of liturgy, story, and healing. Please welcome Kelly Sherman-Conroy.
Good morning, everybody. So in the beginning, one thing, I'm going to talk to you while I turn my ringer off on my phone, unless you want to hear some BTS music while I speak. In the fall, last fall, I taught American Indian, or American Indigenous spirituality and worldviews at Augsburg and in the Twin Cities, Augsburg University, and I had a class at 8 o'clock in the morning. 3 days a week, that's what I said. And I've never had, and so I hope y'all are awake because I literally had a student almost every week fall asleep right in front of me. So I have learned to wake you up. So if I see anybody, just know I'm going to do a big nudge. But as she mentioned, this is my first year, honestly, as a doctor and teaching, and I've really enjoyed. There we go. I've really enjoyed traveling and teaching, and it's always just been a calling for me, even when I was at a very young age. And so one of the things that I like to do is to just kind of, the more you hear me, sometimes you'll hear some of the same stories, but as Christ kind of taught us, right? As we learn through Christ and Christ's words, every time we hear a story, we hear what we need to hear, right? We learn, the words always speak new. At least that is how I grew up. That each time those words spoken, something else really speaks to me. And I grew up always thinking I was going to be a liturgist, not a liturgist, a writer. And my grandfather used to tell me that I was going to be a healer, and I remember thinking, I'm not going to be a healer because I don't like science. And, I was one of those students. Math, science was not my kind of thing, and I never understood that. Never understood what my grandfather meant. And then fast forward a number of years, my mother is a pastor in the ELCA, and she started a New Start mission church in Rapid City, South Dakota, called Woyatan, which is still there, Woyatan Lutheran Church. And honestly, we started from the beginning. It was an interesting process to be a part of, and we ended up with a church, so we got a wonderful church, no people, right? And so it was my job to build the family ministry, and literally went door to door all over the neighborhood and speaking to Native people and trying to bring people in. And eventually, it's a whole nother story, but our ministry grew, and it grew because we learned to kind of we brought in our Native understanding and spirituality and our worldviews into how we do church. And because of that and the ways that we did, our Native congregation really began to grow. And we had really Christian, non-Christian Native people and people joining us in worship. And I'm going to explain that in just a minute as to why. But there was a gentleman, he was an elder from my tribe, and he would often come and he'd sit at the back of the church, and he wasn't Christian, but he participated in absolutely everything. And we were a huge church about food, right? Food was a huge part of our ministry, and but he would always just kind of sit and he would talk to people. And eventually one day he came in and I was the only one in the congregation, and he said, and he came in, and so I made him a sandwich and some coffee, and we sat him down and we were kind of talking. And then he got up to leave, and he shook my hand and he said, I know why you're going to be a healer. And I remember thinking, I kind of looked at him because he knew who my grandfather was, but by that time my grandfather had passed away. And this wasn't a conversation I often ever had with anybody. And he looked at me and he said, and he put his hand on top of my hand, and he said, you're going to bring people to Christ. And for me, that was, kind of a freaky moment, because I honestly had no idea how he came to that point, right? So I remember calling my mom and saying, Mom, I just had this conversation, and so-and-so just said this. And she didn't say anything. She said, I've not had that conversation. And I didn't understand what that meant, because there was no way I was going to become a pastor. And so once again, I was kind of denying myself a little bit as to what my role in life was going to be. And eventually, speed up, I went to seminary. And I attended seminary at Luther Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota. And for those of you that do know, seminary, they really make you think about who you are and what your story is. And I thought I knew my story. And then I realized that I was never telling the full story. I grew up in a community after we moved off the reservation in a small college town in South Dakota. And I grew up in a community where I had to learn to be two different, entirely different people. And so when I moved off the reservation, when I first moved, I remember life was life. I just loved life. I was very young, and I loved life. And people were people. And that was how I saw it from growing up on the reservation. And I moved off the reservation, and pretty soon people began to have labels. So I wasn't just a person, right? I couldn't do a lot of things, or I couldn't actively speak about a lot of things because people didn't understand, and I was too little to try to explain, because for me it was life. And so I began to kind of grow up in these two different worlds and not share a lot about who I was. When I was growing up in schools, I didn't learn much in schools about Native history. I learned it through my family. And so when I got to St. Paul, all those years later, I never really sat and told my story. And I remember sitting in worship often, and it didn't have that connection for me. Everything that I was going through was just that. We were just going through these steps of worship. We welcome each other, we pray, we sing a song, we pray again, and it was just that. It was always the same, changed up a little there between the seasons, but it just became this thing I knew I needed to go to. I knew it was sacred, I knew it was important, but it wasn't connecting to me. And then I met my mentor, Dirk Lang, and such a great man. And he taught me a lot about worship and the passion and the transformations that can happen in those liturgies and the importance of that and understanding that. And I remember at the time he was working on a liturgy for the commemoration of the Catholic and Lutheran churches, right? And I was just kind of watching him go through this process and just seeing how they tried so hard to find ways to connect people, and ecumenically, which sometimes isn't the easiest thing to do. And so I started playing with my own liturgies. I started creating things. And at first it was, people were saying, well, you have to follow these certain things and you have to do all these, right? And that I realized was the problem for me in worship, was I couldn't connect myself fully. And I didn't see myself in worships. Like even when I would go visit, it was really hard to be a part of the story. The story wasn't really for me being told. It didn't have to be about me, but I couldn't connect to those stories in ways I was being told I should or I could, right? And so I started playing with liturgies and trying to figure out a way to really tell the stories. And that is when I started kind of trying to understand who I was and what my story was. You see, this is my family. In a lot of Native culture, you'll often find there isn't too much of a difference between time and space in this. And so when I say my grandmother, she is this person right here in the dark with the braids. She is my 3 times great-grandmother. At the time in Minnesota, she was 19, 20 years old in the 1860s when she was imprisoned in the largest prison internment camp in United States history. She and the Sansi Dakota people, along 1,700 women, children, and mostly elderly were imprisoned. Next to her, the kind of stoic gentleman in the middle, is my uncle, her brother. He was imprisoned along with 300 other men, all Native, not necessarily Dakota, in the state of Minnesota. And this was the time during what they called the U.S.-Dakota War. And you see, so they were separated from each other, and my grandfather, who wasn't a part of this picture, and they were separated each other for a long time. Eventually, my grandmother and her people were exiled out of the state of Minnesota. It actually became a state just after they were exiled out of it. And she had to move around. So when they left, when they arrived, they were 1,700 people to the prison camp. When they left, there were 1,300 people. They moved to a place called Crow Creek, South Dakota, that was created specifically for them. And they lived there for not quite 3 years. If you know anything about even just driving through desolate kind of state spaces where there is just nothing but grass, right? That is South Dakota. And then, of course, then we're in the Midwest, and even think climate change here. So there's the weather is worse, really harsh, right? At that point, they couldn't sustain a life where they were. They lost almost 300 people, most of them children. And so it got to the point where the missionaries from the Episcopal Church and the Presbyterian Church that were following them had to advocate for them. And eventually they left. I mean, when the US government decides, okay, it's bad, it had to have been. So they moved them to where is Santee, Nebraska. And that is where they are to this day. A lot of the Santee people. They were eventually able to come back into to Minnesota. And my uncle eventually found his way to his family after being imprisoned for a number of years. But the one thing that I learned through the resilience of my grandmother was that when she was in the prison camp, she was baptized in the Episcopal Church with a large number of her tribal people. And one of the largest questions I often get from people is, how am I, or anyone, Native and a Christian? Because of the traumatic history, right? And it is an ongoing history that is still today, there is still so much happening, right? And that we attach so much of this trauma to anything that is Christian, whether it's just the word. It could be Christian, it could be Bible, could be God, could be Christ, it could be anything, right? Because as Indigenous peoples, we endured so much. But see, the thing that I grew up always understanding and being told as I was little was that my grandmother didn't find it hard to become a Christian. See, because when she heard the stories from the missionaries, so when the missionaries came and they were telling these stories of Christ, right, and the lessons that Christ was trying to teach us, she got it. Because they were already, for generations and generations before, already living like a Christ-like life. Who they were and are as a people, Indigenous people all over this nation, understood that because they were living that way. Their knowledge, their wisdom, the values and how they lived their lives, how the stories came to them, they were living that all out. So they knew that it wasn't, what was causing the harm wasn't the message of God. It was the messengers. And it was the messengers that struggled with understanding who they were, because it wasn't fitting into that narrative of what they felt a Christian should be like. And because of that, they were imprisoned. But because of the resiliency and the strength of my grandmother and her people and Indigenous people all around this land, many of us are able to tell these stories and know our stories, know the traditions, understand the wisdom and the philosophies and the ceremonies, because they held on to it regardless. So when my grandmother, during that time, all across the United States, it became illegal to speak in any native language other than English. Right? They were unable to dress the way they wanted to, practice their spirituality, any of that. And because of that, eventually they become studied, right? And then when they become studied, it's an interpretation of what people think, right? And so what the narrative is that is out there about Indigenous people, most of the time is very well misinformed. And it's because a lot of that knowledge that's out there was an interpretation of, right? And a great example is Black Elk Speaks. Has anybody ever read Black Elk Speaks or heard of the book, right? Beautiful literary artwork. But it was the interpretation of Neihardt, right? He was a poet, he was a writer, he was really great, but it was his interpretation. So what they ended up doing was, because he left out a lot of stuff, he left out that Black Elk was Christian. By that time, he was Catholic. And a whole lot of things, right, was left out of that narrative. And so what happens is they published this book with the original notes and everything in it, so that you can see what Black Elk was truly trying to tell. And he wanted to do that so that his people could hear the story. He was a part of my tribe, right? So they could hear our story and understand how God is in the world, right? That who we are isn't such a scary thing, that God is active in our lives, right? So it's when I understood and began to understand that story, that the land that I was studying on and living on now still is the real birthplace of my grandmother and her people. That is where their creation story begins. This is where they're born. And when I began to understand that, the way that I looked at, there we go. The way that I looked at worship and writing became very different, right? It became more intentional, right? So I'm going to tell you another story. I wrote this one morning when I was kind of missing my family, my grandparents. I was really raised by the elders in my family. So I wrote, the brightness of the crisp, clean white snow disappeared beneath my feet as I took each step. The quietness of the day broke with each breath as I took, and the sound of my heart beating, I heard my ancestors' heartbeat telling me I was not alone. She had white hair and a soft smile, with these little creases around her eyes that always made me feel safe. In my memories, she's still present. I can't hear her words, but she brings me warmth like the sun when I see her smile. Sometimes I often forget that she is a part of me. Her strength, her resilience, her loving nature, all of that lives within my soul as her gift to me. So I carry her beautiful blueprint of my life within my heart and my mind. So have you ever been immersed in a story, immersed in a narrative that you forget for that little bit of time all those troubles that you've been carrying? This is my grandmother. Do you know what it feels like to kind of be on the edge of your seat, right? Waiting to hear what's going to be said next. What does it mean to find that little glimmer of hope that radiates through your entire person, through another person's words? And does your liturgical experiences bring this kind of connection? So what I'm going to go over in the next few slides, my goal is to encourage you to think about story in a different way and how we create those spaces with story. How we use our liturgies and the things that we are creating for people to be a part of, right? To be inspired by these stories so that you can be creative with those spaces that we create. My grandmother was one of these. This is my grandmother Alice, and this is me when I was about 6 or 7 years old. And she always encouraged me to see the world in so many beautiful ways, to see God in the world. And I grew up very different theologically thinking. My grandmother was actually a Jehovah's Witness. But she never shied away from how she saw God in the world. And she never shied away from teaching me the beauty of how God is in and with us everywhere, right? So I really believe that liturgy holds this power of storytelling and healing if we do it in a beautiful way, right? In an intentional way. Because storytelling is really robust, right? It's this transformative tool for connecting people. We kind of we're able to break down those walls and heal wounds that people carry that sometimes we often don't know about, right? So what is it about storytelling that so captivates the hearts and the minds of people? How do we use storytelling as this kind of innovative way within liturgies that creates healing and brings people to this reflective mindset that transforms their lives and their relationships. So the point of my talk today is to get you to think about how you approach worship and how you can be transformative. Because for me, worship is like a form of activism. That means not only am I helping find ways to tell the story, I'm finding ways and creative ways to educate people. And I'm finding ways to connect people within that liturgy, right? And I'm finding ways to empower people to act. Right? That is all what activism is about, is to speak up, is to not just read the books and tell the stories, but to do something. And that's what we want people to leave our worship with, right? Is to go out and feel empowered to do some change in the world. Even if it's with themselves or if it starts at home, right? How or what you are creating and how we do these things, how are they changing and transforming and empowering people to want to act? That is all what activism is about. It's not a scary thing. And so I think that it really helps us to think about what storytelling is and how it's designed to appreciate better how we bring storytelling to our own lives before it's possible to comprehend a beautiful story that captivates us, right? And so, I'm not sure, I need one of those clickers one of these times. It's looking at how God is a storyteller. We are a people of story. Isn't that beautiful? As Christians, as people of faith, we are part of God's story. God is our storyteller, right? Liturgy is this essential part of Christian worship. We know this, right? It's this set of rituals. We have the prayers and the words that guide us in this communal expressions, right, of worship. But see, liturgy is not just a set of these kind of rote actions. It's a powerful means of connecting with the divine, with God, experiencing healing, and sharing our stories as a community. So I want us to explore a little bit about the power of storytelling in liturgy and the role of God as the ultimate storyteller. You see the healing properties that we can get from liturgy and how liturgy can form and be a form of activism, right? That brings people together. So first and foremost, I think it's about remembering that God is the ultimate storyteller, that the Bible is this kind of tapestry of stories that reveal God's character and love for humanity. We all know this, right? That these stories connect us to God, and they teach, and they connect us to each other, and they teach us how to be community, and they inform our understanding of who we are, what we believe in, and how we act in the world. So, right? So liturgy really is this continuation of God's story. So it's an opportunity to remember, to retell, to relive all the stories of our faith. But it's how we are helping people to see that and walk through those steps, right? When we engage in liturgy, we're kind of participating in something that's really much larger than we are. And so we're participating in unfolding God's story throughout this story throughout human history. It's all these things. So liturgy, we really have a huge responsibility when it comes to liturgy, right? I think liturgy is the most beautiful form of storytelling when it's done correctly. I was speaking with my friend Jonathan last night, and we were kind of working on some stuff for the Festival of Homiletics, and one of the things we were talking about was just the power that we have when we are creating liturgy, right? I don't know about you, but when I get out of a good worship service, I feel so good, right? But those moments sometimes are few and far between, right? And for me, it's like this how do we find a way to share our experiences, our joys, our sorrows, our hopes with everybody, with each other, and bring this opportunity to kind of connect on a deeply spiritual level. And sharing our kind of innermost thoughts, our emotions, our with the people around us. I had a student one time, I was talking about land acknowledgements. There's a whole, don't get me going on this, but I'll tell a little bit. But land acknowledgements get a little annoying for me because often they make it sound like we're not here as Indigenous people. We once walked this land, right? There are these moments at the beginning of sometimes worship, sometimes meetings, right? And you acknowledge Indigenous people and that's it, and you move on. And I was telling my confirmation class, and one of my students said, he said, Kelly, I think I get what you're saying. He said, when I'm in worship, he said, I think what you're saying, land acknowledgements, is a lot like the Lord's Prayer. And I remember going, uh-oh. And he said, when we go to worship, we say the Lord's Prayer. And we know it's important, but it just becomes this thing we say. We say it and we move on. I know the words are important. You tell us they're sacred, that Christ is teaching us, blah, 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 right? He's going through all this. And he said, and I think that's what you're saying about land acknowledgements. They're just words. They become just words when they're supposed to be so much more. And that really made me think. It actually, because of that 7th grader, he got it. It's like, isn't it great? Like when a young person like gets it and you're like, yes, they're listening. But there was that beauty in the innocence of his response and an honesty that we often don't tell ourselves, right? And I remember going to our pastor, I said, sitting at our staff meeting saying, how can we do better in worship and not make our students feel like, it's just another something, because we know it's more than just the students that feel that way. And it was this, how do we inspire and challenge and transform? And sometimes I think when we're trying to think of all those things, it gets so hard to do because there are so many people, and that's the beauty of living in such a diverse world, is we all don't pray the same. I'm sure we don't have the same theology, but we are there to worship and experience the divine, right? And how do we do that? But we have all this heaviness of planning something to try and reach everybody, that we begin to just, as we do it even in my own congregation, okay, here's the map and the layout of the liturgy, and we just kind of plug a new song in, we plug a new reading in, and it just becomes this same thing every week. And just like my student said, we want to learn, but it's not connecting to me, right? And so I'm going to tell you another story. So this is the land. I grew up on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation on the kind of the back 60 of my grandfather's ranch. They lived on the area of the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation called the Sand Hills, and it was just that. If you understand anything about American Indian history, you know that Native people were forced onto lands that nobody else wanted because you couldn't really sustain life, right? And so this is absolutely beautiful, but you can't really grow anything. And so my grandfather became a rancher, and he and his father built this ranch. And right in the middle of the homestead was my grandfather. About a quarter of a mile down the road was my uncle and his family, and we were up this long dirt road about 2 miles or so, and that was our family. A mile from us was my other uncle and his family. And then about 6 miles either side was 2 villages. And the villages were places that are still there today, but the villages were places where originally when they were moved onto those lands or forced onto those lands, that is where, tribes, bands within the tribe would have these areas to live, right? So these 2 villages, that's what they were. They didn't really have a store or anything like that at the time, although one had a school. They were just homes. And often some of the elders would walk all those miles to come to my grandparents, and they would sit outside and they would chat. And they would always talk in Lakota, and I often had no idea what they were saying, because by that time, it had only been legal for Native people in this country to speak in their language legally. It took that long. And so quietly they held on to their language, and they would speak it, not in front of others for a long time. And so we didn't learn it in schools and things like that for quite a while. Eventually it was taught in the school that I grew up in before I moved off the reservation, but it was new to everybody in a lot of ways as well. Right? So I grew up with this understanding of very old language, but these elders would come, and if they didn't tell me stories, they often taught me through actions, right? And so one day my mom drives me down, and she drops me off at my grandma's, and my grandfather would get up at like 4 a.m. So he gets up and he goes out and he's feeding the horses and the cows and doing all that stuff, right? So he goes out, and so my job was to hang out with my grandma. And so she always put me to work, and I was in the kitchen, and because she cooked breakfast, and like my uncles and my families would all come by, even if it was just like to grab a piece of bacon, they always stopped by Grandma's house on the way to do whatever they were doing. My job was to make food for the pets. So we had dogs and cats, and they ate better than mine does. So my job was to make oatmeal and use the bacon grease, right? And you dump it in and you serve it. So they were, fat and happy animals. And coffee. See, my grandfather taught me how to make coffee. I don't drink coffee, and this is probably the reason, is because my grandfather taught me that if the spoon can't stand up in the coffee, it's not strong enough, right? And so that's why the church ladies don't like me in the kitchen, because nobody wants to drink my coffee. So, and I do. I think I bought like a half a thing of Folgers into the bag, and I just did it for Easter and got in trouble. So, but that's how I learned how to make coffee, because my grandpa was always working full time, right? He was out there on the ranch doing his stuff, and so he needed to be awake. And so I remember seeing him drive up, and he drove this old Chevy Silverado, and he was driving up. So I said, Grandpa's coming, and she said, well, go take him some coffee. So I go out the door, and I'm standing there waiting for him. And that little picture you saw earlier, the little girl, that was me about that time. And so I had my little piggy tails on, and I'm running out there, and I'm waiting for my grandpa. And so I give him the coffee, and he pats me on the head. And clearly he's a little tired. And he looks at me, and then he turns around, and he walks over to the sprout. And there was this tree sprout kind of in the road on the ranch there, and about a little, to my waist when I was little. And he stands there, and he's looking at it, and then he goes to another one, and he does the same thing, and my grandpa is just looking. And he motions with me, so I move with him. And we kept doing that. And I realized that this was one of those moments, even when I was young, I knew how to recognize when I was being taught. And this is a very indigenous way of teaching, often was through showing, right? And so my grandfather takes me to the next one, and then I go to the next one, and we're going. Eventually we go through the corrals. And there were these wooden corrals with this one kind of level red barn. And the red barn was often where my brother locked me. And so we would go through we went through the corrals, and we went up onto this hill. So if you were to turn around the other way, you would be seeing down a hill looking onto the ranch. And I remember we get up there, and we sit down, and my grandfather pulls out of his pocket, like grandpas are awesome, right? My grandfather always had candy or food on him at some point, anywhere on that body. So he gives me this little Snickers bar or something. And see, this was like a problem with my mom and my grandma the most, my aunties, because if we were going with grandpa and we were driving, we could drive through 3 towns We didn't actually drive through 3 towns. We stopped through 3 towns on the way to wherever we were going to get a snack, right? And so I do that to this day. That drives my mom crazy. My son and I mean, seriously, like on the way here, I think I took 10 hours because I kept stopping to get a snack. And you don't need the snack, but you just get the snack. And I'm pretty sure that's a part of my lesson from my grandpa. And so we're eating and we're sitting in the grass, and it had just rained. And you know what it's like when it just rains? That is one of my most favorite smells. Like, so we're sitting there and you could smell this beautiful wet grass and some manure, and you could smell that. And then sometimes, have you ever had one of those, like a little bug or something go by your ear and it went zzz? And I remember that, and I remember hearing these little gnats or whatever they were, and then you could hear the horses down below, and they were stomping, and they were kind of wisping their tails, because there was a lot of horseflies at the time. And then there were these 3 little tiny birds, and they were teasing this chicken hawk. We called them chicken hawks. And you could hear them, and they were like these little squawks or something, and then you could hear the chicken hawk squawk. I'm sure the chicken hawk was cussing. And they were just going about, and they were going all over, and life was happening, right? And we sat there for a long time, and then finally my grandfather gets up, and he says, okay, Kelly, you get to choose the place. We're going to go down this way. And if you drive anywhere in most open countries where there's farm or ranch land, you see those long tree lines, right? And we learned that those tree lines are there to help kind of protect from the harsher elements, so we kind of protect, right? So my grandfather and his dad had grown this long tree line, and it was kind of like my forest. So when I didn't want to get locked in the barn or stuck in a haystack because of my brother, I would go to this little forest. And I was so excited because my grandfather never went to this with me before. So I'm it's a 6-year-old and her grandpa, and we're walking and I'm talking, and I'm sure he's thinking, and we're getting down there, and I take him to this tree, and there's this big tree, and it's this big, huge tree, or at least to me it was. But at the very bottom, you know how the roots can sometimes they curve. And there was like this natural seat, and you could sit in it and just snuggle back, right? I mean, that was my spot. It's like the tree was hugging me. And I sat my grandpa down, and he's like, why did you choose this place? So I started telling him why. I mean, this is my place. Like, this is my friend. Like, I was protected, right? It was a safe place for me, and I was just talking, and then pretty soon I remember he looks at me and he says, Kelly, we're going to have to chop your tree down. After I just got told him it's my friend and my favorite spot. And what does a 6-year-old do? Cry. And so I cried, and I yelled, and I screamed, and I was running to my grandma's house. And my grandfather is following me. And by the time she comes out, she's standing on the porch step with her hands on her hips. And I'm pretty sure I woke up Canada at that point. And she's standing there, and I run past her, and they had this green wooden screen door, right? And I remember I let that door slam hard, and I ran through their house, and I jumped on her bed, and I could hear my grandma, and she says, Dad, what did you do? I gotta take a drink. And you see, my grandmother had 3 ways for me of me telling how she felt about my grandfather at any given time. You learn this quickly. Pa or grandpa meant, which was what I heard most of the time, was he was in the good, she loves him, everything's good. Dad was just that, kind of like, what'd you do? It was that kind of, okay, you did something, let's figure this out. And then there was Tom. And Tom was not. I didn't hear it much, only in public for the most part. That meant he was in trouble. So usually when I was out in public, my grandfather was the chairman of our tribe, and he was a judge. And when I heard Tom, I often thought he was in trouble, and he probably was. And so eventually my grandma comes in, and she says, Kelly, you need to go talk to your grandpa. I'm 6. I'm mad. And so I remember, little girl, piggy tails, not my choice, going out there. And I let that screen door just flap open, and I stomp out there. I had an attitude growing up. And I remember standing there, and I'm thinking, I'm going to be mad. I'm going to be mad at my grandpa. I'm going to be so mad at my grandpa. And he's standing there, and he's wearing these kind of Wrangler boots, and really worn, and these worn jeans. And he always wore flannels, so he had this red and black flannel on. And he wore this cowboy hat. My grandfather had silver hair, very short, and he wore this cowboy hat that reminds me of like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, Paul Newman, Robert Redford, right? And they're like these little cowboy hats, and they had swagger before I think that was even a name, and they tilted it just a little bit. That was my grandpa, except for his had a sweat ring. And he's standing there, and the sun hits, and it hit his eyes just right. And in that moment, I couldn't be mad at my grandpa anymore, because I was looking at probably the most majestic man I knew in my life, then and now. And I couldn't be mad at him. I so wanted to be mad. And it was just this beautiful man standing in front of me. And his gray eyes were just shining. And he says, "Kelly, what do you see?" And I remember I didn't want to answer him. And he says, "Kelly," he said it again. So I said, "Fine." I remember thinking, and then I'm going to tell him. I started naming everything that I saw, because to me, so all the dogs and the cats had names. I could name every single chicken. They had a name. The cows, the horses, bodies of water and spots of land on the ranch. Everything had a name and a place. And it wasn't just a name. I was talking about family. And not one moment during that time did my grandfather stop and say, "That is not how we see the world. That you can't call a dog your brother." You see, the way I grew up, I was taught that the Holy Spirit resides in and amongst absolutely everything. That means the land, the water, the animals, my tree. So often when people think we talk about spirit animals, that's not necessarily the case. It's that understanding of the Spirit, and that Spirit resides in us. So in Lakota, we have a word called Matakiwe Owasi, which means we are all related. And people often think, well, it's only Native people that have this deep connection to creation, but that's such a lie. That's all of us, because God is so majestic and beautiful that God created this beautiful, diverse world, but God created it in a way that we are never alone, that we are always connected. So the difference is Indigenous people, we just don't separate ourselves from the story of creation in the way that we often do, whereas often we look at creation on the outside as a responsibility, right? But not as a familiar responsibility. And so I grew up like that I grew up with this understanding that your pain is my pain, that my celebrations are your celebrations, that when the water is in danger of oil coming through, we step up because that is our sibling hurting. And so when all this social transformation is going on all around the world, Indigenous people, so Standing Rock was a great example, right? Indigenous people were stepping up and stepping out and speaking out because there's just this understanding of God in the world, that God speaks to us in ways that we can understand. Think Pentecost, right? That my grandmother could become a Christian in one of the most horrific times in our United States history because she understood God. That God wasn't different, but how she celebrated her relationship with God was different for other people, and they didn't understand that. Rather than taking the time to understand how she and her people and these native people across this land experience God in a daily experience, right? Lived experience, people condemn them. People want to convert them. But that's not how God created us to be. Or it'd be an awfully boring world if we were all worshiping and talking to God in the same way. That's why we are made the way we are. So what my grandfather was doing that day was he was going to the Sprouts and he was praying. And he was telling the Sprouts, thank you. And he was talking to them and explaining to them what was going to happen. You see, my grandfather didn't just pull up anything like that. He talked to them, he prayed to them and said thank you for them, and then said, you just have life somewhere else, right? Because you can't have a tree grow in the middle of the road. That wouldn't work. And so what he did was we eventually went back and we dug up all those trees and we moved them over into my little forest. And that's how he maintained that forest, right? And so I remember he pulls out this handkerchief out of his pocket and he goes to hand it to me and I'm like, ugh. Never take anybody's handkerchief. But inside it had sage and tobacco. And he had me go to each one of these places that we had been, and he said, talk to them. So everything got a name, and I prayed for them, and I thanked them. And like I said, we eventually dug them up, and we put them in the tree line. And my tree, as a child, you don't realize these things, but it was old, and it was going to fall down. And so my grandfather needed to cut it before it harmed me, because he actually knew that I played there. And it tells you how spoiled I was because he made it into a treehouse for me where my brother was not allowed. But what my grandfather taught me was how to walk in the world in prayer daily, right? That the intentions and how we teach and what we do in the world is so important. And you see, it's stories like that. It's stories like that give us a perspective in how we could approach liturgy when we're experiencing worship, right? How do we bring that connection, that head, our heart, our hands, all of that is fully an experience in worship, so that when we're hearing these stories, we're connecting. That when we're picking out a scripture, what are ways that we can tell that story differently? That it engages people. That it doesn't intimidate them, right? I think it's time for a way to make our liturgical experiences more of a human-centric approach. And it's not just about the numbers of attendance or the following of the same patterns each week or staying in the exact timeline, which we have to stay a little bit. Though if you've never been to a reservation church, you're going to be there for a while. Time is very different in a lot of ethnic cultures, and that's important, right? It's how we understand the community that we reside in and how we reach them and empower them and connect them to this divine experience. Right? It's about God's story and creating those connections. And one of the most universal human experience gives us this chance to look through a new lens. It's that kind of responsibility that we have in creating these spaces. And it's about perspective taking, right? It's this life skill that's not just a workplace or a church place. It's a sacred space that is transformational. And I think congregations that learn to prioritize this special kind of inclusion, right? It's in all facets of their liturgical experience. That inclusion will begin to grow, right, in how we see each other in how we connect. So when you're trying so hard to figure out how to connect everybody, actually the work isn't too difficult. It's just learning how to kind of take a fresh eyes at what we've created and how we tell that story. I always put this, I use this at I did this talk on storytelling and what we call sustainable diversion, equity, inclusion. But I thought this was really important because liturgy is a lot like this, and the work that we're trying to do as we're growing, because it's not about trying to convert somebody one way or another. It's helping them. Our responsibility is to help them connect in their journey to God, right? When we define spirituality, I'm pretty sure everybody's going to have a different definition, and that's okay because that's how it's supposed to be. That your journey with God is very different than my journey, right? And often we talk about Indigenous people as and how we see the world as a religion. It's not a religion. It's about spirituality and that connection. So the way that I live and speak in the world and how I celebrate myself as a Native Christian woman is only, for me, deepens my relationship with God, right? It doesn't separate myself anymore the way I used to. And so the way that I go into liturgy and creating these things and bringing that story in is about perspective taking. So that means that intellectual empathy, right? Understanding that what we are teaching and how we are teaching it. That emotional empathy, right? Is that when we are teaching all of this, how are we helping people connect to their story and see themselves and see God in themselves? And that empathic, that feeling, that what happens when they leave, right? Because quite simply, when we look at liturgy and all the different facets in a storytelling kind of way, it humanizes us to each other, so that we build a more sustainable mindset in how we approach. And when you begin to do that, it makes the challenges that we have in our congregations, most often, more than not, easier to approach, right? Because like I said, a part of that is always leaving people with this feel of a call to action. But we don't want to tell people how they should think or act. People need to be able to find their way on that journey, but we can give them the tools, right? Because that's what liturgy is we give them the tools to find their call to action, what they're passionate about, and to explore all these things to connect themselves, right? And when we do all of this, it opens up opportunities for that behavioral, that sustainable behavior change. And what we see in our communities, how our congregation members are approaching the world very differently because they're finding out ways to connect to the world because they see themselves. So then what kinds of stories should we tell? How do we explore? I love this picture. This is one of my favorite pictures. It's by an Ojibwe artist. And it's about understanding how we see beneath the waterline, right? On the face of things, like my church could look really perfect. We donate, we go out and we serve, we do all these things. But often we really don't get to that root of who we are fully as a community. We kind of build and create the narrative through assumptions and what we want to see. But we just started learning how to connect ourselves because each of us, just like these stones, these seeds, we're a seed in this story that then builds into this beautiful picture, right? But we're all a part of that foundation, and we all have a story. And so we're trying to figure out, as we are stumbling along as well, as to how we explore beneath that waterline and learn who we are fully and what each person represents within our community. And so we begin to share our whys of why we want to do these things, why we want to connect. We started asking the questions so that we could rearrange and look at our liturgies and the way we do our worship, right? And we started to find that a lot of people just like me at one time just aren't connecting. They're great. They're happy to be back in person, right? But they're missing something still. But they're there. So we've started to figure out how to share those light bulb moments, those moments of that bring the passion to the people, right? So we're learning how to create our liturgy and create our weekend experiences that really connect people by learning about what other people's light bulb moments are, right? What their passionate moments are and how we can kind of add that in. This was me a few years back at our church-wide assembly. I think this was 2016, right? And this was a moment when I thought that, it was a Thursday. And through the World Council, actually that's my mom in the corner right there, this little lady, so she's short. Or height challenged, is that the word? And Thursdays in Black it brings forward the awareness of the harm and the trauma and the violence against women all around the world. And for Indigenous people, the world is often a place where they're often forgot, that we don't realize that the amount of Indigenous women and girls that have disappeared, that have been murdered. And so on this day, I remember wearing a red hand on my face because I wanted to symbolize and have people ask me, right? Have people ask me what this meant. And I remember going to this worship service, and it had everybody there. And not one person in that entire day came and asked me what that meant. And I remember standing in worship, and we all these people in the white robes, we were doing communion, so we had different spots because there were a lot of people. And I remember standing there, and I had my communion, and I watched people walk out of the line when they realized I was there. I had a woman tell me I was gross, but not one person asked me why. And I quickly didn't feel a part of this worship and the story. And what was a gesture that, yes, was to get some people's attention, but it was to do it to educate people, right? But there was this fear. And I held a lot of hurt and pain because of that moment in what should have been a sacred moment in worship, right? And so, it's looking at the responsibilities that we have, that we all fully feel a part of that story, that we can fully come into those spaces being exactly who we are. So what I want to do as I'm finishing up is I wrote a couple of things. So I'm writing, I'm really excited because I'm the liturgist for the Festival of Homiletics. And I'm writing this liturgy for Bishop Michael Curry in his speech. And I am a person that, I also, when it comes to liturgy, I learn about who's going to preach. And I try to just connect with that person, their message, how they preach. Like, honestly, liturgy for me is just this beautiful way of poetry that tells this amazing story. And that purpose of transformation, right, is just like, who is this person and how can we help them tell their story? Because they're going to get up here and talk for maybe 10 minutes or depending on what kind of denomination, a half hour. But they're going to get up here, they're going to talk, they're going to teach, they're going to share their message, right? And we need to help them, right? So we need to help them. So what I want to do is I want to show you what it's like to experience something like that. So I'm going to read this, and I want you to put your pens and papers down, and we're going to experience this really quick, and I'm going to finish. So we will overcome the obstacles in our path. We will overcome the challenges of our time. Let me hear you more. We will overcome the hatred and division in our world. We will overcome the fear and uncertainty of the future. Let me see you stand up. We will overcome because we have faith in God. We will overcome because we have each other. Let me hear it in your gut. We will overcome because we are united in our love for one another. We shall overcome. In the midst of his final hours, Jesus spoke these words to his disciples. A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another just as I have loved you. You are also to love one another. By this, all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. These words are a challenge and a promise. They are a challenge to love one another when it is difficult. They are a promise that when we love one another, we will be known as disciples of Christ. In the world we live in today, it is so easy to see why love is such a challenge. We are surrounded by hatred, division, and violence, but it can be difficult to know how to respond to all of this. Left side, let's do this side over here. This is my left side. All right, left side. Right side. Everybody. And what do we say together? Amen. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you to Kelly Sherman-Conroy for drawing us deeply into her story and sending us forth. We're sent forth from here to morning prayer. We'll join the VU community in the Chapel of the Resurrection at 10. If you'd like to be further drawn deeply into Kelly's work and story, we'll be in the Brown and Gold room at 10:45 for a workshop where we'll continue this conversation. Be blessed.
I was like, thank you. I was like, somebody tell me.
I mean, we were drawn into the story time.
Thank you. Okay, I will. So the other grandmother. Thank you. Yeah, I always remember that story because I just